Hello viewers, welcome back to the channel. I hope you're well and coping with the break in Formula 1 action at the moment. To give you that F1 fix, I thought I'd make this video looking at the evolution of Formula 1. In fact, today is the first part of a 4-part series where I'm going to look over the last 4 decades at how F1 has changed. Today we're going to look at the 1980s, where cars changed quite dramatically across the 10-year period, where we had record amounts of engine power, where we had new innovative chassis, and where we saw very different car designs. So starting in 1981, we had the first Concord Agreement, where the promoters of F1 and the teams got together to decide how all the money was going to be shared. At this point in F1 history, the teams had quite a lot of freedom on what engines they could use. So we had cars like this Brabham and this Williams, which were using a 3-litre V8 naturally aspirated from Cosworth, and alongside those we saw cars like this Ferrari, which were using a 1.5-litre turbocharged unit, and both engine specs were of similar competitiveness. In 1983 we saw quite a dramatic change in regulations, whereby the ground effect aerodynamics were banned completely and the cars went to much larger front and rear wings. That was an effort to make the sport safer. So previously in the ground effect area, particularly in the late 70s, where very, very low ride heights were allowed and flexible side skirts were allowed, the cars were making huge amounts of downforce, but when they hit a bump, that downforce could be lost completely and the cars would spin off and have a major accident. So in 83 we saw much narrower cars and quite elaborate rear wing designs. The engine specs were similar. In 84 the rear wings got even more elaborate. And in fact, on this Tolman, we saw a double rear wing. Because of advances in engine technology, the turbocharged engines were now able to run hotter and run higher boost pressure. So they were making much more power than the naturally aspirated units. And so all the top teams were running turbocharged engines. We also saw cars like this McLaren, which had the innovative carbon fibre monocoque chassis, which actually was first seen a couple of years earlier, but later on this became the sole technology for a lightweight car, lightweight chassis. Then in 1985 the rear wing and front wing were restricted further by the FIA, so you had to have a single rear wing and its width was restricted. The engines were getting even more powerful, and by 1986 we had cars like this Benetton, which were running a BMW engine making 1,400 brake horsepower in qualifying trim, which, as you can imagine, in a car that weighed 500 kilograms or just over, that was a recipe for disaster. So in 1987 the FIA restricted the boost pressure to 4 bar. And then in an effort to make the naturally aspirated engines as competitive as the turbocharged engines, the boost pressure was reduced even further to 2.5 bar, which is what this Honda engine was running at. But the naturally aspirated engines, like this Judd V8 in this Leighton house, they were allowed to be 3.5 litres now. And incidentally, this March Leighton house was the first car designed by Adrian Newey, which was running very different aerodynamics and much more akin to what we saw over the 10 years following 88, particularly on the Williams designs. The McLarens were still running their carbon fibre monocoques, but by the end of the decade, in 1989, turbocharged engines had been banned completely, and all teams had moved to 3.5 litre naturally aspirated engines, but they were giving quite a lot of flexibility on the configuration. So this McLaren was running a V10, but there were cars running V8s, and the Ferraris were running V12s. Also, the air intakes had changed from just being these rather unaerodynamic snorkels on the side pods to the air intake above the driver's head, which again is much more akin to what we see on F cars today. So there we have it. We have all the cars I've got in my collection from the 1980s. I was born at the start of this decade, so this was when I first started watching Formula One as a young child. Do let me know in the comments if you went to any races in the 1980s. Let us know what that was like. And also, even if you weren't around then, what do you think of the 1980s cars? And how do you feel they compare to the F1 cars of today? So I hope you've enjoyed that whirlwind tour of how Formula One evolved back in the 80s. And stay tuned, because in a few days' time I'll be releasing a new episode looking at the 1990s. Thanks for watching.